Ian Brodie, associate professor in folklore at Cape Breton University. Two very good friends of mine, colleagues, and individuals that I'm so delighted to see, even albeit virtually, to welcome them today. They're experts in the field of contemporary legend, popular culture interfaces with folklore, with the informal, the vernacular domains in which we express and transmit knowledge among ourselves. And today they're talking about a project that they collaborated on about the world we're living in right now and the types of information, misinformation that is circulated through the mechanics and vehicles of folk domains in their work 2020 through McFarland Press, COVID-19 conspiracy theories that they edited with their colleagues. And I'm just going to make sure I have them here. Wendy Welch, Anna Muldoon, Don Leach, and Ashley Marshall. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation today. And just to add to the sort of the sense of the world we live in, we see there's multiple Tiber falsettes, which adds to the whole essence of conspiracy theory. Am I really who I say I am? And I'm just going to say, those of you that logged in by accident as me, because it's not your fault, I gave you the wrong link. And I'm just going to say that one more time, that I see another Tiber Falls that has joined in. Please use this link. It's not your fault, it's mine, to rejoin the meeting. And we're going to have a lovely conversation today between John and Ian about their work, COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So without further ado, can we give them a warm, I guess rather quiet round of welcome through the webinar. So just the two Tiber Falsettes that are there, if you can hear me, just sign back in through this link. Okay, thank you. And I'll welcome.
Where should we begin?
Indeed, where should we begin? Tiber, what would you like us to start talking about first? Kind of link to your class.
Well, it might be good to talk about the process of documenting how these narratives appeal as just stories in their, how they function in being easily transmitted, because they're speaking to that, that sort of homo narrans in us all, to want to share all kinds of information. And I'm also meant to say there might be some terminology in this lecture that might be considered offensive, but it's not. It's being used in the context of contemporary Canadian discourse that's fully respectful. I hope I'm getting that terminology right, John, because I'm doing it off the cuff right now. But it might be different than what you might hear in a contemporary Irish context or elsewhere.
I was just going to say that every country or region has their own particular ways of talking about, let's say, indigenous communities or, racialized communities. And so, terms that we use in Canada might be unfamiliar to folks in the audience, but I assure you that we're trying to use the proper language for each of our communities and be respectful if we do end up talking about other communities that consume conspiracy theories, contemporary legends, and rumors.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
Okay, so you wanted us to talk about why these stories are sticky or transmissible and lovely right off the bat,
and how they work as stories as well. I mean, just the mechanics of them. That what makes them what makes them tick in that way. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll start, Ian, and then we'll. So I think there's a number of different things, and there's a lot of different entry points into them. I think one of the first things that I've been trying to talk to people about and trying to understand myself is that conspiracy theories, as well as their cousins of contemporary legends and rumors, are actually a kind of problem solving. Right? This isn't a strange and exotic thing that only weird people over there do. This is really just the resources, the narrative resources that we have at our disposal, the kind of facts that we have access to, the knowledge that we have access to. And we try to put these things into a form that allows us as a resource to communicate with people and try to solve problems that we perceive in our community and that we perceive in our everyday lives. So these are tools that all of us use all the time. They just have a particular kind of function and a particular kind of a real sense of power and politics behind them now that we're stuck in a pandemic. So there's some serious consequences here, as there usually is.
Yeah. It might be useful to not even really think of them primarily as stories. One of the things that I think about, or when I teach contemporary legend, is that we're talking about urgent communications. I have some kind of information or some kind of question that I'm trying to reconcile, and I need to tell you. One of the things to bear in mind is that legend is not even on the internet, even as broad a forum of the internet, legend is distinguishable from myth and from Märchen by it being an intimate genre. It's not someone telling you from on high and giving you a complete and total narrative. It's often in the sort of its natural environment. It's me pulling you to the side and say, did you hear about what happened? Now, how we do that is that in the process of urgently communicating, we use narrative because that is the way that we urgently communicate. We take these thoughts, we ascribe them to characters, we put them in some kind of temporal location, some kind of series, and then a narrative more or less spontaneously emerges. And that's how we can also tell and retell. But their narrative aspect is secondary to their semantic content. You need to know this. You need to know this right now. Let me tell you a story. Later on, of course, we might have this, I got to tell you this story, and you're going to appreciate it, or in theory, you're going to appreciate it as a story and not necessarily as this form of urgent communication. So when John was talking about how we use our cultural resources, we have all these sort of premises, motifs, as it were, deets, beliefs, worldviews that we can immediately draw upon in order to be prospective, because they're always about like what's happening now, or more than anything, what's happening next. What is going to be our reaction to it? So when I'm communicating, I'm implying typically some kind of reaction and some kind of action to that. A reaction that isn't simply, but an action that is motivating. John?
Yeah, thank you. And so that's an awful lot. I'm sure everybody's got that under their belt now. We're all good. I think so. Maybe I could just take a second to show you a little bit about how this kind of interactive environment happens online. I've got a couple of slides, and so what I'm going to try to highlight here is what Ian was talking about how it's urgent communication between people and we're sharing, right? So let me just see if I can share this little element here. And we'll just quickly jump through some of this here. Okay, so this is from a little Facebook post. This is the Canadian context. So for those of you who don't know, in Canada, our Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. We have a parliamentary system. And so he's been tied to a number of different conspiracy theories during the pandemic by a number of different people. And so I'm just going to roll back this for a second. So here we have this this doesn't look like storytelling, right? But it really is, because it's a collective group of people who are adding bits and pieces to a story, and the constituent, and each little piece that you're looking at here is what folklorists call like a kernel narrative. They're actually attached to much bigger and much larger stories that you can spin out. And they're going to be shared. And when people reinforce, what they're doing is helping the narrator to be encouraged and to create a kind of consensus. But then we've got these kinds of multiple related stories that are going together around a central theme, which is that Justin Trudeau is a pedophile who belongs to a secret satanic cabal who will, amongst other things. But so you can kind of see these kind of symbols that they're talking about. I'm just throwing up some extra resources for people who might not be up on your particular branch of conspiracy theories. Here we've got, Maxwell, of course, Jerry Epstein. And here we've got the fun little thing, he says fun, little thing where supposedly you guys might remember that the ruling elites, especially the Hollywood elites, are part of this large satanic cabal who are using adrenochrome to harvested from the organs of children who are tortured in these giant torture mines. I could go on, it doesn't matter. But we see Justin Trudeau walking away from the podium down here tied into this story. And they're supposedly all actually secretly already under arrest, or some of them have been taken to Gitmo. Some of them have body doubles, this is an obscure one I'm not going to go into. Right. So we get this collective storytelling and collective kind of engagement and the earnestness, as Ian was saying, about the now. We've got to do something about this. We're identifying a problem. What's going to come next? And out of this kind of collective storytelling, sometimes you get a full rendering of a narrative where an individual will combine the bits and pieces. And this is what usually people think of when they think about conspiracy theory: a well worked out, well reasoned, generally cohesive, non-fictional narrative about an event, about how it works, right? But it really is
in terms of purporting to be truth.
Yes.
Just to clarify.
Yeah. Yes. I think the beauty of the conspiracy theory is that, just like the contemporary legend, I suppose, and just like well, more so even than rumor, is the fiction, the fiction of news, right? So in this case, the great pretend is that it is nonfiction. So it's a very fun little dance. But I just wanted to reinforce some of the things that Ian was saying with those little brief examples, that we communicate oftentimes in short pieces of information that don't feel like narratives, but when you get a cumulative bunch of them together, or if you belong to a community that shares this kind of storytelling, you can see the narratives. They're there, all lurking in the background. And that's part of the sociology of it all, I suppose.
Yeah, that's just to sort of give some lame folklore definitions. That's what John was talking about in terms of kernel narratives. Susan Kalchik's term. Bill Ellis uses the term metonym for basically the same idea, that within a group, there are stories that don't need to be expounded because they are commonly known. So they can just be referred to by a brief image. If I say, I've got to go home now, or otherwise I'm going to turn into a pumpkin, you all know the story that I can work my way through the world through references to these narratives. If someone says, what the hell does that mean? Then the story that demonstrates, for one thing, that they are not of the group. And when we talk about how folk groups are constitutive or constituted by their shared body of lore, it's like, okay, if you don't know this story, you are not yet a fully integrated member, at which point the story can be integrated or can be made full and made clear. It's like, oh, you don't know. Well, here it is. There's this young lass called Cinderella. So yeah, metonym, kernel narrative, etc. Just for your nerd friends.
So I guess the other thing is, like, how do we recognize these things as narratives? And I think Ian pointed out a couple of things, but I just wanted to maybe we could dip back into them if that'd be helpful. I mean, Ian pointed out that we've got characters, right? So, Jeannie Thomas had this really great talk recently where she talked about, like, why are we harping on Bill Gates, right? Like, why is he the great villain in our stories? And it's partially because we will take really well-known people so that they stand in for an issue or a cause, the same way that, like we got, Jack and the Beanstalk, right? We got Jack, no problem. So we've turned real people into stock characters, but they're so well known that they're kind of superstars. And so we can use them to stand in for all the villains. And I think that's her main point. And I hope I've expressed it properly. And it's a very useful point, because once we recognize that we've got characters, then you can start to see the world building and the narrative building around them. And as Ian pointed out, we have to set it in a time and a place. And so even though it might be immensely efficient, last week, That's fine. We got time moving, you know. We've got other things like the Wuhan lab. Okay, we got a place, right? And then the next thing we have to do is set the narrative in motion. So what is the horrible thing that's animating the plot? What is happening here? And where are we going to get to? So even though they don't feel like stories, they have all of these kinds of traditional elements that we've already been socialized into ever since we were little. If anybody's ever hung out with a 2-year-old telling a story, you know how much work you're doing to teach them how to tell a story. It's like, who is it? No, who's in the story? Okay, and then what happened? No, I don't care about the peanut butter yet. What happened first? And we've learned the shape of story from our cultures.
Mm-hmm. Not only that, I mean, there's sort of certain elements of classical storytelling in as much as it's in this intense dialectic. Because if you sort of think about, who is it, Axel Ulrich's, epic laws, and that things are done through this massive amount of contrast. So characters are either pure good or pure evil. Populations are purely foreign or purely domestic. And it just, because, I mean, the binary really helps in making narratives simple and easy to communicate. They, of course, are a whole heap and ton of problematic, but you can see how this desire to make our point as quickly and efficiently as possible by ascribing this sort of Manichaeanism to these narratives. They're just laid out bare, especially when we have these narratives of people who sort of switch sides and they go from being pure hero to pure villain so very quickly. Mm-hmm. So these elements of traditional storytelling are so very present in them. And you can sort of look at things like, here I am dropping some knowledge, Kilcullen narratives and, Q narratives, and they're practically one and the same. Boom. John?
Well, thank you. Yeah, and that's why I think conspiracy theories, obviously they work very well in a pandemic, and they're very sticky in a pandemic because the binary, light and dark, right? These kinds of other kind of associations between people, is that they really help us to identify villains. And the identification of the villain tends to be of a particular type within conspiracy theories. The classic one, of course, is the enemy outsider, which is your classic scapegoating. And we see this, and it's, in some ways, the contemporary pandemic is so immensely boring in terms of conspiracy theories because they're old conspiracy theories. They are terribly reductive and redundant. Now, reductive and redundant isn't actually a bad thing. It's where a lot of their power comes from, the repetition and things like that. But one of the things that I find really depressing about it is that the basic model for scapegoating hasn't changed much, and it's here just in a beautiful form. I wonder if I've got his book. Oh. So here's a very clever and very smart book by John D. Lee called A Pandemic of Rumor that came out in 2014, I think. And he says something in there, which is basically he lays out all the conspiracy theories that happened around SARS and H1N1. And he lays out a number of the conspiracy theories, and he says, if we don't do something, the very next pandemic that hits, all of these are going to show back up, and all of the scapegoating is going to ratchet back up. And he was absolutely right. Every conspiracy theory that he outlined in there, every rumor panic that started, was completely replicated in this rumor. And part of it is because the narratives and the narrative structure really work very well to support a scapegoating project. It's not ours, it's the Chinese flu, right? It's not, we weren't the problem, this was China's problem that was inflicted on us. So that's one of the most basic models of, the scapegoating, the outsiding other, right?
But building on that, one of the things that we should think of in terms of contemporary legend and conspiracy theory is without in any way apologizing for those who, certainly those who profit off of conspiracy theory. is the idea that they do arise in these moments of uncertainty. They arise because there is this sort of existential unknowingness. We do not like living within this cloud of uncertainty. And so if the conspiracy theory, one of the things that it does is it provides answers, as unsettling and as inappropriate and as wrong-headed and as vicious as those answers might be, we can still nevertheless see that there is a questioning that is happening that does need addressing. They emerge in times of unknowing. They are answers to questions. They're unsatisfactory answers to questions in terms of an objective reality, but they are very satisfactory answers to questions in a moment of despair. So we want to sort of think about what undergirds them, what gives them traction. It's that there is, even because they're lacking nuance, because they suggest a big bad at the end, they answer things, and we like having answers.
Yeah. I mean, they're a kind of therapy that requires more therapy afterwards, but they are certainly therapy. And I think one of the things that Ian pointed out before, which is good to remember, is that these are collective works. So they, in some ways, actually make us feel less alone, because we're often working with people to problem solve. And so, especially in a pandemic in which we've been asked to self-isolate, we've had limited contact with people, even though we now have this technology, which is lovely. But certainly the sense of social isolation has been quite profound for a number of people. And so collective storytelling is a great way to overcome these kinds of social isolations. So,
and folklore has spoken about collective creation for a long time, but that is often sort of this way of trying to understand the origin of child ballads, or over time this emerges. But I think we have this idea of both a collective creation and a serial creation. There's a kind of almost improvisatory theater aspect to it, where people are like yes anding. It's like here's an idea, yes, and I've heard that. And again, they are dialogues. They're dialogues that, because of the internet, we see them as scripts, and then we sort of conflate them into some kind of unity. But if we go on the micro scale, it's like, this is a line, and then here is something that is contributing to it, and then enhances everything that went before. And then with each and every addition, it is an additional gloss of what happens before. We really are seeing a different way of understanding collective creation. That's the word I'm looking for. Those CCs are hard.
Yeah, and I can help reinforce this for Ian with a small graphic. I have a slide for that. Let me see if I can find the slide for that. So this is kind of the end point of what Ian was talking about, but especially in conspiracy theory, because the conspiracy theory is attempting to explain the world. And the world, especially in a pandemic, the world in any kind of condition, is constantly having emergent facts and emergent processes and crises. That one of the things that ends up happening is that, as Ian said, we have the yes and then there's another thing that we're asked to integrate. And so, somebody called this a degenerative research program. I kind of like to think of it more as a recursive research program. There is always an and. There is always more information that has to be woven into it. And it is part of the artistry of the conspiracy theory. I mean, one of the things to think about with people that are what we would say is highly engaged or highly involved, as well as people that maybe just have much more, just like any storyteller, much more talent for the craft, or much more time, that this is a massive engagement of your time and your talents. This is artistry. And this is a kind of way of people demonstrating their creativity, as well as their, quote unquote, research. So there's a number of practices that go into conspiracy theories that make them not only problem solving, and not only, as Ian pointed out, this kind of clarion call to try to solve or figure out a crisis, but also on a personal level. This is what folklorists talk about when we talk about things like artistry, when we talk about things like the kind of collective adjudication of the community about our artistry to figure out if this works and fits.
Mm-hmm. We also, of course, don't want to forget that these narratives have consequences. So as much as we can sort of sit back and put on our folklorist smock and suggest, look at the beautiful artistry, we never want to forget that, you know, people are literally dying as a consequence of these. Hate crimes are on the rise as a consequence of this. So I'm all on board about talking about these things as aesthetic, artistic creations that really demonstrate some creativity. Yet, ... that doesn't mean that we forgive it all. And the other thing is that not every contribution is going to be successful to it. And one of the things, I mean, a good analog to this is the Slenderman mythos, which is more or less following the exact same creativity as conspiracy theories, and that there is an idea and then someone else contributes an additional idea to it, a backstory, and then more and more people...
Ian, sorry,
yes?
from the great beyond, no one will know. Slenderman has not made it over the water. We don't know Slenderman here.
You do not know Slenderman?
No.
Good. I know very little of it. John is an expert in it. But okay, Slenderman was merged...
I didn't know that we didn't know either, so that's good that I'm learning, Kelly. Thank you.
Slenderman, and again, some of the people who are in the seminar might nevertheless have been teenagers and are just more wired than us. But Slenderman was originally started as a response to a prompt to create a disturbing image. And there were two photographs, black and white photographs by Victor Strang. Oh, Trisha Fabulous says you have Slenderman, so I think we're going to have a bar fight pretty soon. So these two black and white images were created by a guy called, I want to say Victor Strang, was that his name? Mm-hmm. Something along those lines, on a message board. And it would two pictures of a group of children sometime in the 1970s with a mysterious elongated figure in the background. You couldn't really make out his face. He just was tall and slender. And there were captions that seemed to suggest that they had been rescued from some kind of archive, historical record in the 1970s, and it gives the name Slenderman. And that's it. And immediately that caught fire, and people started creating backstory and videos and video games, and the whole collective mythos was created to this sort of wonderful idea that, first of all, entered into actual sort of belief. It started as a creative collection, much like role-playing games. And then it turned into some people actually imagining that the Slender Man was a traditional figure of folklore, of North American folklore, up to the point where there was an actual crime that was committed because someone said that Slender Man had told them to, these two 14-year-old girls took a 12-year-old girl and beat her up and sort of left her for dead in the forest, if I recall. She survived, so not no harm, no foul, but we don't need to... I'm going to stop talking now. Anyway, so Slenderman is this massive part of communal creation. But one of the things that internet folklore scholars have noted is that we can, because the internet is a self-archiving mechanism, we can see people's contributions to this, where they say, oh, this is wonderful, and here's my piece of fan fiction about Slenderman. And the things that work get picked up and built on, and the things that don't work, they just get ignored. It's like, meh, and we move on. With conspiracy theory works the same way. If it doesn't actually fit their own narrative, we might imagine, looking back at it, that there's nothing out of bounds. But there are. I mean, there is actually a sort of a self-limiting mechanism. Thank you, John. A self-limiting mechanism for these things. And if something doesn't work, if it doesn't fit into this large, diffuse thing that is conspiracy theory, it isn't a successful contribution, and it doesn't get picked up. Yeah, that's what I was saying. I want to see the chat and see all the Slenderman.
Yeah. Diver, can you give us some direction? Where would you like us to go next?
I mean, there's just so many directions it could go. I'm enjoying this immensely. Just the idea of the immediate I have to tell you something that is that is to alleviate an immediate concern collectively. That might have been like some of where, like this time, like giving the space for narration to develop. It's interesting to see it sort of in this sort of primordial ooze of storytelling in which this is all emanating out of. What's it like doing this kind of field work when you talk about those barriers about not getting if I don't get home by 5, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin reference, and they have to go down that rabbit hole of explaining it to you? How do you approach that as a folklorist that wants to do field work on it? I don't know if that's
I think there's a couple of things. So mostly, so with our co-authors, a number of us have been collecting material from different kinds of sites. So maybe we should just tell the crowd here what we were doing. So I was mostly working on Facebook groups. And also I was mostly working on Facebook groups which were not initially conspiracy theory groups. So these were Facebook groups which were often formed, like they were anti-lockdown or anti-mask groups, or they were pre-existing groups that I often followed people's links back to. So there's a number of Canadian groups that I followed, which were actually just political groups. They were anti-Trudeau groups, or they were, fairly far-right conservative groups in Canada. And so I found that they were basically they turned into COVID-19 conspiracy groups. They were overwhelmed by this material. And so that's sort of where I was coming from. A number of our co-authors were more active, say, on Twitter, and they were collecting off of the Twitterverse. Also spent a fair amount of time on the rather unpleasant parts of the internet, the Chans, 4chan, as well as 8kun, which is where QAnon was hanging out on 8kun. So there's a number of different places, and obviously the problem with doing research is you're always missing something. So I just wanted to put that out there that we were smart as we could be, but I'm sure that we were missing a number of things. And so what's it like doing this kind of work? It's interesting. It can be, not to be dramatic, but it can be difficult, because you are often hanging out in places which are quite toxic in terms of the kind of material that's being, people are calling for pogroms against Jews. People are calling for burning down of Chinatowns. People are calling for the murder of public health individuals. And we've seen real violence come out of these conspiracy theories. So it is a little bit difficult. At the same time, some of these communities produce very funny things because they have in-jokes, and they have, very relatively creative memes that they share. And a number of different things are happening all the time. But one of the more difficult elements, I think, is trying to get but this is true of any field work that either your students are doing or that any of us do, takes a long time to get a competency with the in-group talk, with the references that are being made, and with all these other things. So I had a friend send me a little Facebook note the other day being, you need to explain Agenda 2030 to me. I'm being yelled at by people. And I was like, oh, I got that one. Right. And so there's a number of like in-group things that are happening. So one, it just takes a lot of time.
What is it? What is that agenda?
It's a fairly innocuous plan to just save the world from environmental destruction and climate change, as well as rampant poverty and the pandemic. UN sponsored, and a number of other groups are behind it. But as that agenda has been absorbed into the conspiracy theories, obviously it is a Luciferian globalist plot to destroy nations around the world, to erode national borders, and to basically bring about the New World Order, which will all turn us into slaves of whatever kind of nefarious, dark, shadowy people are behind the New World Order. So now keep an eye out.
And again, a lot of that is sort of that cumulative metonymic, because once you talk about the United Nations, you are implying all the one world government things that have plagued the United Nations since, well, I guess really since the League of Nations and since the 1920s. So it's just everything that organization does is open to some kind of framing as how does this contribute to their overarching one world government agenda. So again, and it's all this pulling out the threads always leads to yet another thread.
Mm-hmm.
Just to echo John's work, it is not a fun bit of research, even if you can sort of weirdly admire that creativity and sort of start to get the jokes and almost go, ha, 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 that's a good one, if you know are a toxic individual. But yeah, when we were doing the book last summer, I think I ended up being very unpleasant to the people I was talking to on a regular basis, because I was living in this gross world for a couple of months, and it was just like, I was very glad when we said, all right, we're wrapping it and we're submitting it to the press. Like, thank goodness, and I could turn my head off of that for a while and go back to my silly jokes.
Yeah. I think I keep saying to everybody, like, I sort of got into this collecting partially as a form of like pandemic therapy. Like I was just like, oh, I'll call this research and then my world won't feel like it's falling apart. All right. So I just started collecting with no intention of working with people to write a book. And that's sort of what folklorists do, right? We sort of see a phenomenon. We're like, let's start a pile. Let's see what's going on here. If we get enough data, maybe we can say something about it. And like Ian, I would also like to stop because I do find it rather exhausting.
But looking at the world folklorically has both its strengths and its weaknesses. And one of them is that we see creation and creativity and go, oh, that's a thing that's happening over there. And then we like, I guess someone needs to record this, and we start doing it and then despair.
Yeah.
And how do your own experiences, just as creative beings who are engaged in folkloristic documentation, how does this fit into the wider, because I mean, you've done amazing research, both of you, on other occupational lore. I guess it's broadly occupational. We think comedians that's an occupation, as well as people that are growing crops and alternative newly legalized economies, these sorts of things that you've been working on. How does this fit into sort of a wider understanding of our discipline and the ways we perform ourselves to others and interact around these modes of expression?
I wanted Ian to start because he wrote this brilliant chapter on comedy and the visual representation of the pandemic.
Okay, I can talk about that.
Yeah.
I guess there's sort of two questions. There's sort of like, how did we take our previous research orientations and move them towards conspiracy theory, and then what has this idea of conspiracy theory sort of added to our understanding, our general folkloric understanding. But I was approached by John, actually, to say, could you write something about humor and conspiracy theory? And I looked around for a little bit, and there's a lot of stuff about humor and COVID, obviously, but the idea of sort of, I wasn't finding much funny about conspiracy theory for those same reasons. And again, even when there were efforts at humor, they tended to be kind of toxic. But then what I discovered was a cartoonist, a political cartoonist called Ben Garrison, who was, his image was actually shared, one of his pictures was shared to the Facebook group of the International Society for Contemporary Legend Research. And we were like, well, what is this guy? And so I sort of followed through, and I became really interested in the idea of the political cartoon and the sort of the folkloric aspect, because it is ephemeral. Unlike other forms of art, the political cartoon is dated. It needs to be, it's coming out on this day. There's the professional idea of new communications, as it were, having to be generated. It's not as immediate as a conversation, clearly, but it's a rapid response of some sort. It's also expressly editorializing. It's taking the images of the day and trying to create some kind of interpretation and perspective on them, however fleeting that might be. So with Garrison's work, you just saw daily, at most every 3 days, usually every day, a snapshot of one conspiracy theorist's digestion of this changing situation. He already had like one world government issues. He already had Bill Gates problems. He already had many Obama problems. He already had some bizarre Trump fetishism in terms of presenting him like a sort of golden god. And then this new thing emerges, and you can sort of unpack how he takes this new idea of, that came out in the news that day, and yes ands it, and then becomes one of the most influential pivots to the broader conspiracy theory, because then this is taken, and much the way a narrative is retold, this is shared, and then it becomes part of the collective response to it. And so, we don't need to worry about consistency from image to image, but conspiracy theories are very rarely consistent, but they are consistent in their trajectory, because they are always working towards the idea that there is an answer out there, and that the regular actors are most likely, if not definitely, involved. And so, but how do you manage this? What's going on? What's this? Oh, here we go. And all of a sudden you get the plot again. So it really gave me this idea of, it reinforced this idea about how these things become like the way that news is sort of described as like the first draft of history, that these are kind of like the second drafts of history, and that's like it's here's the information, and then here is the beginning of big picture thinking for a particularly insidious group. So what I'm planning on doing from this stuff, in terms of how I'm bringing it back to my understanding, is I'm now interested in they have it in North America, and they sort of have models of it elsewhere, the late night talk show monologue as, again, this sort of immediate response from a noted person on the first interpretation of history. And fortunately, it'll be from people who I do not find terrible. John?
Thank you. I got into this because a number of groups that I had conducted ethnography with had a number of very important conspiracy theories, as well as contemporary legends and rumors that were key to the functioning of their communities. So, for example, street kids in one instance, and illegal marijuana growers out in BC in another instance. And so I caught British Columbia. Thank you. British Columbia, Canada. Yeah. So I dabbled in this material as a kind of lived experience among people collected sort of, really quite spontaneously. And, I had a few informants or research participants whose lives were really structured around conspiracy thinking. So one of my key informants was what's sometimes called a sovereign citizen or a free man on the land movement follower. The idea that all laws passed by national governments are essentially illegal because of a complex folk legal theory that that no nation is that no nation is legitimate, since they are all actually corporations and not nations, and blah blah blah, right? And I think this actually translates into Ireland and the UK. There's been a number of famous cases there with sovereign citizen groups, and so I was sort of interested in. This individual lived off the grid in a trailer, had a partner and 2 children, and was living this particular conspiracy. And particular conspiracy thinking. So that had got me interested in how people's lives are affected by this. And what really got me interested in doing the book and trying to follow this more clearly is the acts of ostension that were emerging really early on within the pandemic, right? So I'll try to show you something. I don't have tons here, but let me just see.
Do you want me to quickly define ostension?
I would.
Okay, ostension is an idea it actually sort of comes from semiotics, but it's used by folklorists to explain how narratives are, well, again, we'll now use narrative in the loosest sense of the word, how these things that are often expressed as narrative are equally expressible in action. So it's one thing to say that in North American Halloween traditions, there are apples in, that people have put razor blades in apples because there are psychopaths out there. It's another thing to take the candy from your children and chop up all the apples to make sure that that is not the case. And by doing so, you are fundamentally contributing to this collective enterprise of sharing the story. Now, you can also be making jokes. There's a whole bunch of things apart from the sincere communication of it, but these narrative fragments are communicated in part through telling, in part through material culture, in part through literature, if we want to distinguish them from oral narrative, and in part through action. So ostension is how they become manifested in performance in terms of embodied living, not simply performance in terms of orality. Sorry.
And that's that. Thank you, Ian. And so what we saw early on, the thing that sort of got me interested in was there were two instances in the States. In one instance, a dock worker tried to plow a train that he was operating into one of the hospital ships of the Navy that was in Los Angeles, and partially based upon the idea that he said people need to know what's going on here. Now, we've never gotten his full accounting of what narrative he was following out, but there's lots of evidence during the same time that this was part of the early Save the Children, the satanic pedophile rings, and that somehow these ships were actually being used in order to, as part of the secret ring to capture children and to harvest their organs and sell them into sexual slavery. And shortly thereafter, in New York City, where another one of these ships had been stationed, a woman was eventually arrested trying to find another one of these ships and to do something to stop it, right? So these are obviously ostensive acts, right? People have a narrative, and as with all legend, but especially with conspiracy theory, we also then have the compelling, almost messianic statement that you must do something about this. We've laid out the problem for you. Now you've got to do something. And so these people were acting this out and literally doing something. In Canada, we've got the fairly recent sentencing of Corey Heumann, who followed the exact same kind of trajectory. He drove from Manitoba, which is one of our prairie provinces, thousands of kilometers to slam through the gates of Rideau Hall, which is the Governor General's residence, as well as the temporary Prime Minister's residence, and armed with a lot of guns. And he was going to try to stop the problem or the issue. So it's when the narratives, because I'm kind of political in my folklore as well, it's when the narratives become action and actionable, and they take on social, political, and violent moments, that really sort of grabs me. And so that's one of the reasons why.
Yeah, and it's difficult to, I mean, maybe political is the right word, but it's sort of difficult to hear these narratives and, again, just wear one's folklorist's hat and say, isn't this an interesting bit of anti-Semitic folklore? If you know that there is going to be some kind of real world consequence, not that narratives are not that words are not real world consequences, but they seem to be of a different order when we're talking about property crimes or crimes against the person, of course, so. Yeah, whether that's anti-Semitic, whether anti-Chinese, anti-whatever.
Yeah, so. And I think we've seen that, recognizably in a number of communities targeted during the pandemic, all over the world, and the perception that that fellow citizens during a pandemic can become strangers in our midst, partially built through narrative, but also through a long history of marginalization and toxic racism and all these other kinds of discourses that surround them. But there are real world consequences to storytelling, and especially in times of crisis and in times where we're trying to solve a problem. We're trying to come up with narratives that help us to understand the world around us. But every once in a while, that story's a loaded gun and we're pointing it in the wrong direction. And that can be really dangerous. And it's one of the things that I like to tell people who might be either cynical or might not see the value of folklore. Hi, Mom. I'm kidding. But my mom is very supportive.
Yeah, not watching this.
Yeah. But I think one of the things, like in common culture, people are like, so what? They're just stories. Why are you guys wasting your tuition money studying stories? And I'm like, because people get killed over stories. Pandemics continue longer than they need to because of stories, right? People lose their lives. So I just think this is an opportunity where this kind of stuff we do is important. I think it has value.
And again, it isn't to necessarily vilify the people who tell them and spread them, because
Yes.
There is some kind of need being answered. But that doesn't mean that our concern for these people extends to validating their belief system wholly and in some. I think of the work of Andrea Kita, who's also been very much involved in this, and in terms of new disease narratives, and she did her work on anti-vaccination communities. And the idea is like, yeah, there, thank you. And the anti-vaccination communities are spreading information that is dangerous, if not deadly, and often is potentially deadly. But listening to their concerns, their valid reason why they do not necessarily trust medical expertise, does not extend all the way to letting them have their belief systems. A comedian friend of mine, again, the way worlds overlap, sort of had this tweet the other day about how there's kind of this difference in kind between belief in Bigfoot and belief in QAnon, in that, live and let live if you have Bigfoot belief, but it's not really the folklorist's job to debunk Bigfoot, yes or no. But when it comes to there's a different kind of consequence. And so it's the point where we sort of have to, say, no, I will enjoy the creativity only to a certain extent, at which point I will have to sort of put away my ivory tower objectivity or disinterest down and say, yeah, this is a problem. I can definitively say, you guys are wrong. You need to stop your creativity, or channel it somewhere positive, like D&D campaigns or something.
Yeah. Well, that's a question I've got in the background is, do we see counter narratives that are using these mechanisms as ways of engaging with the very real concerns that come out of identifying with them? Like, in Andrea's research, and I'm thinking Cleon O'Carroll at University College Cork is doing, as part of the Cork Folklore Project, contemporary COVID-19 documentation, as we speak. But she's tying it into also narrations around illness and pandemic as a wider, as a longer term thing, to try to give a wider breadth of contextual background on these types of narratives. Do you see any solutions and through the mechanisms that are so successful in spreading misinformation to also countering misinformation in that sort of vernacular context? I don't know if my question was probably too all over the place there, but
no.
Is there a way that we can, do you see it at, other narratives' success in trying to counter the misinformation through the same mechanics that are spreading it?
I think before we speak about counter narratives, because counter narrative seems to be a response to.
Right. That you're right.
We could also sort of, be humble and recognize that the parallel narratives that do not necessarily deal in conspiracy are nevertheless operating through the same mechanisms of a creative understanding of how things work. We're just using different sources that we trust more, perhaps, and we being the very highly subjective. I trust these organizations, these government bodies, in a way that the conspiracy theorists explicitly distrust those and trust others. But I mean, I don't think it's much, it probably shouldn't surprise you. I don't know how viruses work. I'm just taking it totally on faith. I got a kind of idea. It's like, oh, this is good. I shouldn't inject bleach. Okay, that sounds good. And my understanding of this is on the same built on the same sand as the conspiracy theorists. It's just that I trust this sand more because switching metaphors, if I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, I trust these giants more than I trust the giant that is Q. But I don't know a goddamn thing about how a virus works. I'm a folklorist. I've wasted my life doing this kind of thing. So I have no practical skill in terms of combating disease, but I can speak intelligently to a group of people who are similarly minded because I have a fairly decent fluency and competency in narrative building, narrative ingestion, and narrative regurgitation. And so I can, and you and I and John all probably agree more or less about the proper way of combating COVID. And I don't think either of us really have a great grasp on the science. Maybe John a little bit more because of his delving, but otherwise just like, it's sort of, it's the same kind of creativity. So then when we come to doing a counter narrative, it's just like, oh, well, the counter narrative really is doubling down on the actual institutions that can provide some kind of synthesis to this, because a counter narrative suggests this classic thesis, antithesis, synthesis notion, when really we have two parallel theses that need to battle it out through some kind of greater, more intelligent, a quaestio, as it were. I'm not just dropping some medieval theology on you in terms of the best way of arguing this. So counter narratives are always this kind of problematic way of, on one hand, they're necessary, but the question is like so very vast because it assumes that it's just these good people, you, myself, John, Kelly, and who are, fighting the good fight, and we know what's up. It's like, well, we don't. We just have better faith in the people that we think know what is up.
Yeah.
So,
and I think Ian gets this this kind of crisis that lots of conspiracy theorists, scholars are faced with, as well as media scholars, sociologists, as well as politicians, where we have a kind of epistemic crisis. We have these different groups who understand and construct knowledge based upon dissimilar criteria. So, and so when we're dealing with these kinds of knowledge communities and these insulated knowledge communities that no longer even share a terrain in which we talk to each other or are available to talk to each other, then it's hard to have counter narratives. It's hard to insert yourself into that because you're actually engaged in knowledge production, which is remarkably dissimilar from each other. Mm-hmm. And so what you really would need is a lot of semiotic warriors to essentially, kind of take on these personas of these CT communities. But that starts to sound like political dirty tricks. And it doesn't sound like something that academics should be involved in.
It's ingenuous at the best.
Yeah. But at the same time, we've got, a kind of knowledge crisis. And that is not something that's something that's expressed in these narratives. That's something that we can study. These are communities that we can come to understand and understand them better. But the actual practical skills of overcoming this particular historic moment, that's the work of thousands or millions maybe of scholars and people of good faith and goodwill, I think.
Mm-hmm. Not that I want to cut us off because we're getting to the hour mark, and I know you've got a lecture coming up, John, but I see we're getting some questions in the chat that sort of feed into where our discussions have just gone, that might be worth exploring further.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them.
We have one asking, how do you differentiate conspiracy theory from truth? For example, things that start as conspiracy theories but end up being true or having evidence. Like when we find Bigfoot finally, how does that stand for other conspiracy theories and their plausibility? I feel like the lines blur a lot and people don't know what's true and what's not. And the next question sort of feeds into that last one. I was wondering what your take is on these harmful theories targeting working class communities and leading to classist views when really they're being taken advantage of by much more powerful, wealthier people. I've noticed it here in Ireland that people of power will spread these views and then blame the people who believe them. Two comments, questions from the audience here.
I can try to. I'll just give the really short version of that, and Ian can fill in where I leave off. So the first thing is that conspiracy theories are built upon facts. They are built upon evidence. It depends on how you define facts and evidence. That's the epistemology problem, right? The knowledge construction. But the world that conspiracy theorists inhabit and the world that they present in their narratives is the same world, right? There is Wuhan, it's a place. There is a Wuhan lab. There is a real level 4 lab there. There were scientists working on gain of function for the virus. All that's true. It's just where the story ends up. So the difference in conspiracy, I think there's a couple of places where conspiracy theory, there's a couple of places where you can sort of find the difference, the kind of sieve that you have is not, is there facts here? Because there is always facts here, okay? The sieve that you need is what is happening inside the narrative. So if the sociological and unfolding of history is explained by conspiracy, then that might be a problem. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't real world conspiracies. There have been plots and conspiracies. But the number of historically verified plots and conspiracies is actually relatively small. Now, Alex Jones, if he had a batting average, this is not going to work in Ireland, sorry, I think American baseball, the number of things that Alex Jones has been wrong about, he couldn't make a little kid's baseball team, right? So it's not, right? So there is conspiracy. It has happened. Does it happen in the frequency that you're being presented with? I think the other thing that's usually a good litmus test is when we get to the end of these stories, are you being asked to hate somebody, right? Are you being asked to blame a group? And this gets back to the second part of the question, which is that when we get into political conspiracies or when we get into the utilization of political conspiracies, oftentimes that's being used by powerful people to identify the problem as either outsiders or marginalized insiders. So if you're being asked to blame a group that realistically does not have the power in your society to carry out the acts that they are being blamed for, then you are probably being fed something which is not going to be helpful. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but.
Mm-hmm. I think conspiracy theory also does really well in the atmosphere of grievance, where one's personal situation is such that you are not simply you feel disadvantaged, but you feel deliberately disadvantaged. So there must be some kind of bad actor there, especially if you have also been told most of one's life that follow this particular path and you shall be justly rewarded. At the very least, you should be safe. At the very least, uncertainty will not be your milieu. So once you have this well of grievance, then you have the possibility of further exacerbating these bad actors. And you can always exploit them. You can even introduce the concept of grievance, where it's like, hey, this thing that you are feeling, don't worry. It's because someone hates you. You should hate them too. And then it becomes this sort of oddly self-fulfilling prophecy. So but John's point earlier about how there's always facts there is the same thing, that they are facts. Now, not always. There are certainly made up scenarios as well, or made up meetings or misinterpretations of events that if you actually sort of go back to, I'm going to say original sources, but more trustworthy sources, you hear the thing and not the spin on the thing. Right. Because we don't always go back. We base it on the most recent iteration of that.
Right.
But they make sense. They are coherent. And it's difficult to dismantle coherency, even at those times when things are contradictory.
Right. Yeah, it's that weaving of facts through the art of narration, that where they're getting to the mechanics of storytelling that creates the context in which it unfolds. Our colleague, Dr. Barbara Nealon, has a question. She says, I think what John and Ian had to say was fascinating, and many thanks. But she wonders how you've managed the human aspect of your research when you were interviewing, or do you is it an interview or talking aspect of discourse, or is it more observational? Did the people that you were engaging with give the impression that they believed the conspiracy theories, or did some say that they didn't?
So mostly it's simply passive data gathering on my part. I'm working off of open source Facebook groups and open source web pages. And when I have interacted with people, which I do once in a while, not all that often, what it generally is a kind of prompt to try to get people to talk more or to say more. And sometimes that prompt is, I don't believe you. But sometimes that prompt is just, hey, that's really neat. Could you? Right. So I'm not leading anybody outside of their comfort zones or anything. And obviously all ethical things are being followed. So I'm not interviewing quote unquote real people yet. That's sort of going to be stage 2 of some of my research. Sorry, what was
that in your own field work in other contexts, like in the occupational lore, of having that real person of when the ostentation comes into the lived narrative part of it. Yeah. What's that? I mean, how does that work? Not that I don't know if that follows on from Barbara's question or not. In some ways, if in the particular context where you're really in a moment of a comedic expression where it goes in a certain direction you weren't expecting in that moment of of exchange or yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I think the second part of hers had to do with like what we might think of as sincere or earnest or honest discourse, and that can be quite difficult. I think it's hard. I mean, especially on the Chans. I mean, the difference between play and purposeful, speech is very ambiguous, and especially say, Ian's environment with humor and with the ambiguous talk can be just mind numbing. But for my own work on the Facebook groups, a surprising number of people have public pages. Like they have their Facebook set to public. So you can go and you can scroll through their pages and they are absolutely public. And these are real people. These are not Russian bots. These are real people who have, grandchildren, and they have posts and things like that. So, you can do some checks.
I also am. I stick to the very even the more public pronouncements than Facebook, which has that kind of. Facebook is almost like sort of doing research in a restaurant, in that everyone is in the public, but they might have the expectation that their things are private. So you kind of have this weird, am I overhearing a conversation or not? But my work with Garrison was on his website, through his Twitter feed, and on those sorts of discussions, and then people sharing them through Twitter, and then some commentary. That might, on the other hand, well, the only sort of thing about sort of how I was interacting is that when we did the book, we wanted to reprint some of the cartoons in it, and so I actually contacted his wife, is actually his sort of social media organizer, and so wrote a letter and said, do you mind if we use these? Would you charge for them? Because even if the work is repulsive, you kind of want to pay artists, Again, that weird level that we have when we're talking about people that disdain. And so, and he had the right to refuse republication. And she said, no, all you have to do is put a link to the website in the caption. It's like, okay, I will do that. And then I contributed to the site because I felt I couldn't do it without some kind of recommend. And now I'm on the mailing list. So, I get an email every couple of days, which is very fun. So I think I feel ethically okay with how I have treated Garrison, and I feel ethically icky for having supported him in some way. And I'm just sort of sitting on that for a while. Ethically icky is a very technical term that you can explain to your students later.
Yeah.
Well, this has been wonderful. There are a few more questions. Stefan said that it's kind of Trumpian. I think that might have been going back a few moments. And then, Dr. Nealon says thank you for your answer. And we have another question. Would you say that the SCP Foundation would be an example of collective storytelling?
Yes, very much so. I mean, SCP, and SCP is all, secure, contain, protect is I think what SCP stands for. Oh, John, you're in your early 50s while I'm in my late 40s. Therefore, I am much more into what the kids are into. SCP basically started as this sort of collective piece of fan fiction where it's a sort of self-contained wiki where about these sort of mysterious objects. Then people can create them. There have been video games that are built on them, and people will create. My son's into it, and he's only 12, and he'll create training scenarios and new narratives that collectively build on them. Now, SCP, ironically, has had some, like I was talking about Slenderman, some boil over into the realm of actual belief, because I was talking in conversation with Lynn McNeil and Andrea Kita, and I was talking about SCP, and she said, oh yeah, well, we've had students who not only will go there as through their supernatural classes in terms of like demonstrating it, but then a couple of students are like, oh, I think they're onto something, and actually kind of fell down the hole of this thing that it really is known as fan fiction. Sort of most of the participants are like, yeah, this is just a thing that we do for fun because it is our collective creativity. But then it's like, it just becomes so thick, and like, oh, what's going on here? It is a box of wonder. So SCP would be a very good example of something similar to the Slenderman ethos, but then ironically similar to conspiracy theory.
Well, following on Ian, this old man has to go to bed, I guess. It's like my nap time or something. Actually, I have to go and teach a class. I'm going to leave you guys to run through the rest of the issues and questions. I just wanted to thank your students and you, Tiber, for giving us a chance to have a chat today. This was a lot of fun, and I do apologize for stepping out.
And I hope I hope when things are better, we can have you over in person, John, for a nice visit at UCD.
That would be lovely. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you so much. We have one more question, Ian. I know we don't have to rush out. I don't want to overextend. Now have it all fall on your shoulders. You've been very generous. But there's one question that came in the Q&A here. That was, do you think because of Trump no longer being in the spotlight that the QAnon conspiracy theory will die down, or will a new crazy theory with new political characters begin? I think that goes back to the earlier discussions that you were having about, and all of these narratives that have been studied by us that have circulated in the past end up recycling themselves in the next crisis.
Yeah, they tend to become refurbished, as it were, and upcycled in some way. I mean, prediction is always a mug's game, but I think one of the things is that as it is based in fact. Conspiracy theories are based in facts, or rather the interpretation of facts and the interpretation of current events. And QAnon, in very much so, what we were talking about earlier, in that it's a call to action, an assurance about how things will settle out. And sometimes that settling out will be because the people who are in on the narrative need to be active participants fundamentally in ostension, in making it come to pass, making these predictions occur by storming the Capitol on January 6th. It really depends on how much of a public figure and an actor Trump is able to continue to be going forward. I think that's one of the concerns. And then the other concern is, and this is where I put on my idealist's hat, is will the desperation for answers disappear, or at least ebb a little bit, if the desperation of people's circumstances start to ebb? Will the intensity go away if not only things like vaccination become such that the pandemic is more or less at an end, or at least we can sort of see it in some kind of manageable sense. If the economic uncertainty in the United States of the past 12 years, basically since 2008, starts to be starts to adjust over time, if the employment rates become standard, if opioid addiction starts to be treated as a genuine public health concern as opposed to a moral crisis or a moral failing, if these the situations where people feel aggrieved can start to be fixed through whatever circumstances, and maybe just simply through time, will the desire to have the bad actor that QAnon suggests as being operative in the world, will that disappear? And again, disappear, no. Ebb, perhaps. The community will sort of fade out. And these things that were present might just sort of move back into the realm of traditum, of beliefs that aren't necessarily believed. John sort of started at the very beginning about speaking about how these, we have this sort of, all these elements that we can bring to the fore. And it's nice to think in terms of our, again, as a person who loves classic folklore, our classic folklore theory of active and passive traditions. And we can think about active and passive traditions in terms of actual beliefs. If I were to say to you, if I were to break a mirror right in front of you, probably you all know what that signifies. You might not necessarily believe what that signifies, but you are fluent in it. So you can make an argument that this is basically a passive belief, something that is known to be, bad luck for the few who might not know what that is, known to be a belief that is in some kind of active circulation, but not necessarily one that you adhere to, or that you believe, that you know anyone in your immediate circle actually believing, and yet you are fluent in it. Stereotypes work the same way, and that we can also, I mean, that's a lot how a lot of joke works, in that you take a group and you ascribe them to type. You might not believe in that, and that group might be your own. You might be more than happy to the Irish to tell jokes about the Irish, which you know doesn't reflect reality, but you know the joke will be understood because everyone is conversant with the beliefs that are associated with, and in the frame of joke, it's like, okay, we're moving forward. We can go here. Dumb blonde jokes work the same way. You probably don't think that way about. I hope you don't think that way about blonde people, but you know what they mean, so you can be there is a cultural fluency there. When we talk about these sort of beliefs, anti-Semitism, anti-Chinese belief, we might not, they might sort of reside in our passive tradition aspect and then slip on over to our active, and that no. You know why? Because the Chinese do eat these strange animals. And it's like, okay, so and I think there might be an argument that a lot of what QAnon has done is basically sort of activated these passive beliefs and turned them active. And that, with time, hopefully with time, they might just go into passive. And perhaps we can make a strong case that, passive, joke anti-Semitism is not much better than actual anti-Semitism. It's like, I don't believe in these things, but they make for good jokes. Like, well, maybe don't keep on spreading the jokes so that they don't hop back over and fill in anti-Semitic to anti-whatever group.
Crisis. It activates again.
Exactly. Especially since the beliefs can sort of transfer from group to group, as like Christy Davies' works on ethnic jokes occur. They're contextual, but in certain places the dumb Polish joke works the same way as the person from New Jersey or the person or the blonde, and they're transferable beliefs because of almost what's the migratory legend kind of processes. So that's a very long-winded answer, which an hour and a half in, you're probably used to my long-winded answers at this point.
They're excellent, and I'm very grateful for it. I'm learning a lot from this discussion, and I know the students have been in. I see lots of thank yous there in the chat. I don't know if there are any other questions. It's been both John and Ian have been very generous with their time, and we're grateful for them both for that. Is there Kelly? Do you have any questions? Are you still there? Or
Yeah, no. Thank you. I'm just like, again, grateful. John and Ian have been fantastic.
And yeah, I mean, I was just the last part that you said about migratory legends, and what I'm thinking about, if you start to see, is there structure and function revealing itself through these more critical engagements with this type of material that we can start to, as folklorists, create a framework for the interpretation of this sort of material.
Well, it's like we need
doing research on it.
A rapid response motif index.
Yeah,
and that exactly. because they are, as much as we talk about things being recycled, and as much as John said that it's almost how boring conspiracy theory and COVID is because they are recycled, they nevertheless are manifested in new moments each and every day. And so a new villain can emerge, and that villain is contiguous with and yet distinct from the prior villains. They're functioning in the same way. It's an ogre as opposed to a dragon, but
right.
We should also explore the idea of ogres,
right.
because why this particular person was fits that interpretive slot, or fits that semantic slot in a story, is a question in and of itself. And it has to, but I don't know. It's just so large. I mean, one of the benefits of studying Märchen is that we study things that only made it to print 300 years ago. So the texts are nice and finite. It's like, there we go. And then once we get into the ability not simply to record in the late 19th and 20th centuries, but for everything to be recorded on the internet, that sort of the entire non-self-selecting archive that is the World Wide Web. Oh, that's just so much. Yeah. What do you want from us?
No. I don't think we're going to ask for more. Yeah. It's been amazing, just the research that's been coming out, and the contribution that you and John and your collaborators have made is it's adding to developing this particular part of our discipline in remarkable ways. So I'm very grateful, and I think everyone else would like to join me in thanking you. I think this has been a wonderful seminar. Thank you so much, Ian, and thank you to John too, who had to go and teach a second class. We're very grateful that he made the time to speak with us today. So thank you both so very much. Yeah, give a round of applause here, and thank you to all the other timers for your patience at the beginning as well.
Thanks, thank you, Ian.
Thank you. And if Alison Confrey showed up, hi Alison, how's it going?
Yeah, I hope Alison came. I mentioned, I'll send your good wishes if she didn't make it.
Excellent.
Yeah. Oh, and Kleina's saying hello and thank you.
Kleina's saying hello as well. Yeah, I'm looking forward to. It's too bad we won't all be at SEAF in Helsinki in person this year. Well,
yes.
Someday.
Alas. Oh well. Sometime in the future we will be together again, and we will hope to find you too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Ian. All the best.